Welcome! Today we will be doing Part A and Part B of reactions in aqueous solutions, metathesis reactions, and net ionic equations. Here we have all the reagents we'll be using in today's experiment. They each have their own clean, unused pipette, and all handling will be done wearing safety goggles, a lab coat, and gloves. Our first reaction today is copper 2 sulfate and sodium carbonate. We're going to start off by adding 15 drops of copper 2 sulfate to our first test tube. Copper 2 sulfate has a light blue color by itself. Next, we're going to add 15 drops of sodium carbonate to the same test tube with our copper 2 sulfate. After copper 2 sulfate and sodium carbonate are mixed together, we lightly tap the tube to mix the solution. We see that a turquoise precipitate forms in our test tube. Our second reaction today is copper 2 sulfate and barium chloride. We're going to start off by adding 15 drops of copper sulfate to our second test tube. Next, we're going to add barium chloride to our copper 2 sulfate in our test tube. After adding our copper 2 sulfate and our barium chloride together, we lightly tap the tube to mix. We see a white precipitate form in our test tube. Our third reaction is copper 2 sulfate and sodium phosphate. We start by adding 15 drops of copper 2 sulfate to our third test tube. And now we're going to add 15 drops of sodium phosphate to our third test tube. Having added our copper 2 sulfate and our sodium phosphate together, we lightly tap the tube again to mix its contents. We see a light blue precipitate form inside the test tube. This light blue color is a visible difference to our first reaction that gave us a turquoise precipitate. Our fourth reaction today is sodium carbonate and sulfuric acid. We're going to start off with 15 drops of sodium carbonate to our fourth test tube. And now that we've added our sodium carbonate, we're going to add 15 drops of sulfuric acid to our fourth test tube. Immediately after adding our sulfuric acid, we see bubbles and an audible gas release from our test tube. The solution is still clear and colorless with bubbles. Fifth reaction is sodium carbonate and hydrochloric acid. We're going to start off by adding 15 drops of sodium carbonate to our 5th test tube. Having added our 15 drops of sodium carbonate, we're now going to add 15 drops of hydrochloric acid. Our solution is still clear and colorless. Upon mixing our sodium carbonate and our hydrochloric acid together, we still see a creation of bubbles. For reaction 6, we have cadmium chloride and sodium sulfite. First, we're going to add 15 drops of cadmium chloride to our 6th test tube. Having added our 15 drops of cadmium chloride, we'll now add 15 drops of sodium sulfide. Our cadmium chloride and sodium sulfide solution makes a bright yellow precipitate in our test tube. Reaction 7 is cadmium chloride and sodium hydroxide. To begin, we're going to add our 15 drops of cadmium chloride. After we add our cadmium chloride, it's time for our 15 drops of sodium hydroxide. Cadmium chloride and sodium hydroxide give us a white precipitate in our solution. Next we have reaction 8, which is nickel chloride and silver nitrate. We'll start off by adding 15 drops of nickel chloride to our 8th test tube. Note the emerald green color of nickel chloride in the test tube. Now we're going to add 15 drops of silver nitrate to our nickel chloride. Nickel chloride and silver nitrate give us a white precipitate. It's pretty thick. It's forming at the bottom of the tube, as you can see. For reaction